We all learned a lot this morning, so thank you for the learned speakers and your participation. We had one dropout for, if you got the early invitation, Dr. Pedro Schwartz is a famous economist, president of the Montpellier Society, which is a society started by F.A. Hayek, an Austrian economist who later won the Nobel laureate. And Sir John Templeton was a member of that society. And during one meeting, a few years after he started the foundation, he met Father Sirico at the Montpellier Society meeting. I don't know if he met you before. And when he started the foundation, he asked the Acton Institute, Atlas, and the Montpellier Society to occupy roles as members of that society. Key members of the Templeton Foundation are also members of the family, like Lauren Templeton, grandniece of Sir John. Dr. Schwartz is not with us because, again, Spain is a beautiful country, has socialized medicine, so sometimes when you have to go to a knee operation, you go when the doctor tells you to go. So 8 days ago, he told us he could not come. But during those days, the topic of ethics and economics also came up even stronger to the limelight of policy debates due to the new encyclical of the Pope. So we are lucky that Father Sirico is with us, and that Lauren, who I recall my first sightings of her were at the first members meeting in Tennessee, in the in the St. Andrews High School in Tennessee. And while people were discussing science, she was reading stock tables, The Economist, but that's many years ago, perhaps you were a high school student, but then she started her own hedge fund. And she should be a person that completely optimistic because she has been very productive. She has 2 beautiful daughters. Together with her husband, Scott Phillips, she has written superb books, that concentrate on the topic of maximum pessimism rather than optimism. So their book that they co-author, Buying at the Time of Maximum Pessimism, focuses on the philosophy of Sir John Templeton of being, an educated contrarian. And again, she collaborates with a think tank, so completely versed in topics of free market economics. So I want to thank her for taking time for her busy schedule as member of the Templeton Foundation and as a wonderful mother to help moderate this session and say a few words about Father Sirico. Lauren Templeton, thank you for being with us.
Thank you. First, I'm not an expert at free markets and free enterprise. I'm just very passionate about it and spend some time reading about it. And of course, it's very compatible with my business. But it is my pleasure to be here with you today to moderate this discussion with Father Sirico, who's a friend of my family and the John Templeton Foundation. He is a member of the John Templeton Foundation. And I'm told that my uncle first met you in Guatemala in 1990 at a Montpellier Society meeting and was very impressed with his speech there and became involved with Father Sirico then. So Reverend Robert Sirico received his Master of Divinity degree from the Catholic University of America following undergraduate study at the University of Southern California and the University of London. Father Sirico co-founded the Acton Institute with Chris Allen Marin in 1990. His writings on religious, political, economic, and social matters are published in a wide variety of journals, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and the London Financial Times. He is a member of the Montpellier Society, the American Academy of Religion, and the Philadelphia Society. He is the pastor of Sacred Heart of Jesus Parish in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So welcome to Father Sirico. We did have a panelist dropout, and so I'm hoping this will be more of a dialogue with the audience. I have about 5 questions planned, and we have an hour. So I'm hoping you guys will ask lots of questions. First, I would say, through the John Templeton Foundation, we have a family grant program, and every year family members are given some money that we can allocate to 3 of the John Templeton Foundation's areas: science and spirituality, character development, and free enterprise. And for about the past decade, my husband and I have teamed up. We've donated our money to a local school in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where we live. And we've run an essay contest called the Noble Purpose Essay Contest, where we ask students to write an essay on someone in our local community who has lived a life of noble purpose. We do not identify or define noble purpose for the students. The students have to define it themselves, and they have to go interview someone who has led a life of noble purpose and describe that. And one thing that has really struck me over the past decade is that I have never once received an essay from anyone in the for-profit field. So the young students are writing essays on people in non-for-profit activities and really exclusively rely on that as a framework for noble purpose. So about 2 years ago, I went to them and I explained to them the problem, and I gave them a lecture on the morality of profits. And I thought I did a very good job in this lecture. And I said, you know, since I'm the one judging your essays, I would really like to see some essays on the for-profit industry. And the next year, I got back the essays again, and they were all about non-for-profit endeavors. So the students, even after being told that, still wrote on that. So my question for you today is, you know, at one point, profits were thought of as a result of hard work, diligence, patience, calculated risk-taking. And it seems to me that the whole concept of for-profit activity has really been divorced from these virtues, and now are associated with things like greed and cheating, or gaming others for their own, gaming the system at the expense of others. So how do we address that with young people, and what will change the perception of for-profit activity?
Well, thank you so much, Lauren. This is exactly why I began the Acton Institute, to begin to speak about the nobility, or at least the potential nobility, of free enterprise, of the craft of entrepreneurship, because it's so easy to vilify. I mean, I think the tug in the direction of envy is so powerful that it can become the default moral position of a lot of people. And one of the things I have said many, many times when I lecture in seminaries or in religious gatherings, because I think a lot of this moral suspicion of enterprise comes out of a misunderstanding of ethics itself. I quote a philosopher by the name of Étienne Gilson. He's a French philosopher, very highly regarded, well-respected, and he said something really quite intriguing and memorable. He said, if you want to build a cathedral, the facade of which represents the rising of the soul to God, you picture Notre Dame or any of the medieval cathedrals. He said, if you want to build such a beautiful cathedral that represents the rising of the soul to God, you must first understand geometry. And then he went on to say this, which I wish was on the portal of every seminary in the world. He said, piety is never a substitute for technique. For without technique, piety is helpless to make use of nature for the glory of God. I think we just default and we think, you know, that the person who is pious has you know, attained a high moral level, and I don't want to depreciate that as a priest. You know, I think piety is a very, by the way, that's another word that gets a bad rap now. You say, oh, a pious person, you know. But the real villain in modern society is the entrepreneur, because, well, partially because a lot of them are villains, especially when they are not so much earning a profit as they are scamming a government program. Because a lot of businesses, I think this is, by the way, and we can get into this if you want, part of the problem with the Pope's recent encyclical letter, Laudate Si, which has to do with environmental concerns, I think his economic analysis really suffers from a certain stereotype of what he thinks of as free enterprise, but is in point of fact crony capitalism. It is a close engagement with the favors that the state can distribute, and there's a ton of stuff to say about that, but I think you've really hit it head on, and I think these kids need some good models of business people who are living noble lives. We produced a documentary called The Call of the Entrepreneur. I know that you've seen that, which really tries to tell the stories in a heroic way. What I'm not saying is that the making of profit is a sign of sanctity, right? But neither is being poor a sign of sanctity. Being poor is the result of either being excluded from the potential of creativity or just not doing anything. Because if you want to be poor, all we have to do is sit here long enough and we'll all be poor. That's not the exceptional circumstance. That's the most usual circumstance of people on this planet for as long as we've been on this planet. The exceptional circumstance is to find a way, a system, an organization, institutions that support a person's creativity and guarantee them the right to the free exercise of that creativity.
Yes, in today's society, it seems like a lot of our creativity or business creativity is spent gaining access to government officials
Right.
and curry of favor, et cetera.
Yeah, the whole phenomenon of lobbying.
Yes.
You know, people say, isn't it evil lobbying? And they look at the lobbyists. But it's really not the lobbyists, is it? I mean, if you think about it long enough, after all, I don't get people coming and lobbying me. Why don't I get people lobbying me? Because I don't have anything to give them. But when you have a political class or bureaucratic class or a whole institution built on doling out favors, whether those come in the form of actual subsidies or certain kinds of protection of their business or promotion of their business in one way or another, of course you're going to have people come to you, because any entrepreneur who wants to get his or her product onto the market is going to come to you if you have the favors to dole out. So the lobbying isn't the real root problem. The root problem is the extensiveness of the intrusion of government.
Right. Well, can you define what are the essential virtues of free enterprise?
Well, I think the essential virtues of free enterprise are the essential virtues of humanity. And you can take that from a variety of different angles. You could talk about the seven, the cardinal virtues that speak of, well, let me just speak in general in terms of one's integrity. Integrity is living on the inside as you live on the outside. Living, and this is a good way to teach a child, living and embedding in a child's mind and conscience that he or she is being observed, not literally necessarily through surveillance, but that there is a standard, there is a law, there is a moral standard that rises above the subjective feelings and whims that we have in our own lives, so that we're responsible to a higher moral standard. I'm trying to put this all in very general ethical language rather than specific theological language. So integrity, which is closely associated with honesty. In fact, the virtues all bump into each other at some point. If you perfect one virtue, it will bump into the next virtue. Generosity of spirit. By that I don't mean just giving away money. That's good and appropriate. But I mean a generosity of spirit where one shares knowledge with other people, one encourages other people, maybe one gives assistance to other people. I think a certain, now this may sound strange to some practitioners of business, but a certain detachment from the material world. In other words, not confusing one's product with one's being, not confusing what I do with who I am. This will lead us into a discussion of technology and profit, but I'll leave that alone. So I think a certain detachment from the material world where you don't confuse the means for the end. I think those would be some general characteristics that I would identify initially, and there's so many more that could be.
I always think patience is
Oh, yes,
a well-known virtue. And speaking,
perseverance.
Yeah, and perseverance. But when we're talking about patience, right now it seems to me we're living in a society of instant gratification. So what are the implications for society's sense of morality in this type of environment? And when I'm talking about instant gratification in my business has really manifested itself through low interest rates. So basically anybody can have the American dream if they're willing to put down 0 to 5%. They don't have to work that hard for it. It's all instant gratification. So do you have any thoughts on that?
I think instant gratification is very often the result, not just of our own innate hedonism, if you will, but also in society, and if we bring it to the question of economics, it's very, very often the result of a society that is losing hope. What goes along, by the way, with a sense of instant gratification is the lack of appreciation for building families, because that's a very great and important part of prosperous societies. When societies build families, it tells you that the people building those families have hope into the future. And those societies where hope is dissipating, very often because of inflationary policies, taxation policies, redistributionist schemes, or even well-intentioned but deadly, economically deadly social security kinds of things that create an intergenerational warfare, what ends up happening is that people live only for the moment because that's the only thing they think is real. I see very often in the States this sense of desperation on the part of young people in the inner city, where they know some of their friends have been killed for, whatever reasons, and so they live for the moment. And if they have $100 or $200, rather than putting that in a bank or building a business or even the old lemonade stand, they'll buy a pair of sneakers or the most in vogue jacket, rather than delaying the gratification, which itself is a characteristic of a mature person. You need these kinds of qualities in business because you have to look down the road. From an accounting point of view, one of the deleterious things in modern finance is always looking at the quarter, the next quarterly returns. I was just at a conference with Peter Thiel, the very well-known serial entrepreneur who you may remember founded PayPal, was the first outside investor in Facebook. And he pointed out in his new book, 0 to 1, that if he is being approached by someone as an investor, he wants to know that that person is going to be around for a while. He doesn't want, if they take or demand an inordinately high salary, even when you couple it with some ownership in the company, that demand for exceptionally high salary may be an indication that they want to get it all here and now, and he'll tend not to do business with them. There's a very interesting observation he made. He wants people in love with the enterprise who are investing themselves in the enterprise, because that's the guarantee. Human beings are at the root of the economy. They are the center of the economy.
Right, but I would say that governments are really encouraging this instant gratification by providing the low interest rates, and there's so much debt and borrowing around the world.
Right.
So if profits are moral,
Maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, so we don't think profits are moral.
No, I didn't say that. It depends on what you're making a profit on. You could make a profit on selling people, and that would not be a moral profit.
Right.
But profits in a society where the enterprise has been legal and itself is justifiable ethically, those profits are exactly what you're aiming at. It's an indication that you have done your job. You have accomplished what you were planning. So in that sense, I just want to be clear so that St. Augustine said once with regard to the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, he said that the rich man was not in hell because he was rich, but because he was proud. And the poor man was not in heaven because he was poor, but because he was humble. I think your great uncle would have liked that quote.
Well, profits in combination with rule of law when you're not violating somebody else's property rights
Right.
or,
So
yes.
in that sense, okay.
Yes. So would you say that the Fed's use of monetary policy is moral or not?
The more profound question you should ask me is, do I think that the Fed is moral?
Yeah. Okay.
And I would say no. No, because what is it? It's substituting power in society for authority. Now, I'm getting that distinction from Robert Nesbitt, who wrote a beautiful book called The Quest for Community. And he describes authority and power as two forms of constraint. Power is a form of constraint that is external to the person, and authority is a form of constraint that is internal to the person. So I presume your husband acquiesces to certain demands that you make upon him, not because you're holding a frying pan over his head, but because he respects the institution. Well, there may come times when you have to resort to the frying pan, but in general,
He'll vouch for that.
it's the marriage
Yeah.
that is the authority. So you see, that's an internal form of constraint. An external form of constraint is someone who will literally put you in those handcuffs or put you in jail if you do not conform, who can use external measures to get your conformity. And largely what the Fed does, and there's a lot of other ways that this can happen in society with the abuse of power in society, largely what the Fed does is preempt the institutions of society itself, the knowledge that entrepreneurs have, that investors have, that create the interest rates, that also give us the knowledge of the risk involved and the potential for the productivity and the success and the, do I use the word profitability of the enterprise? The Fed obscures all that, and because it's interfering in prices and knowledge, it dumbs down society. So I think that it is not only deleterious, but immoral for the Fed. So, I think we do much better. I mean, there are a lot of different solutions to this kind of problem, but competition is a way that if we had banks competing, people would know which were the best and which were the worst of the competitors, and they would gravitate to the ones that they saw were best suited to their needs. If we keep these interest rates low, we're inviting people into trouble. We're inviting all of us into trouble.
I would agree with that. I would say we were already in trouble. Speaking of technology, he mentioned technology earlier, and I'm just curious now as we see everybody around the room on their smartphones, and I don't know if you're tweeting or looking at Facebook right now, probably, instead of listening to us, but are new advances in technology and artificial intelligence compatible with free enterprise? And how do we protect freedom and free enterprise as technology continues to grow and take over more aspects of our life?
We might think that this is a new question that's presented to us in the post-Silicon Valley age, but this is really an old question. I'm sure this is the question that came up when fire was invented or when the wheel was invented. I certainly know it came up when the combustion engine was invented, because now what are we going to do with all of the shoesmiths and the people who tended to horses, or the people who made these beautiful saddles and all of those things that were associated with horsepower. And now these new mechanical buggies would come on the road, and it's going to just put everybody out of business. It's going too fast. Can the human body take that? The worries about electrification, if you read the accounts at the time in newspapers, that people were afraid that this was going to create unhealthy situations for people. So I just want to say that human advance always has associated with it some form of technological questions that are not just related to the economy, but also related to ethics. With the advance of now high levels of computing capacity, the iPhone I have in my pocket, I'm told, is multiples of computing capacity to what it took to put Apollo 12 mission into orbit. So we're aware that there is a speeding up of information. And it raises the question not only of technology in terms of robots, and by robots I don't mean just those things that go around, but I'm even talking about nanotechnology, where we can, in a short period of time, be able to place small robots, I mean microscopic robots, you could probably put 1,000 of them on the head of this pen, into the body, direct it to the organ that is diseased and treat it from within, and then remove these nano machines, these little robots. There's obviously a great potential for good. There's a great potential for evil. But the thing that I don't think that it's doing, and this is where I draw the line on artificial intelligence, I don't think it can change the nature of the human person. And as long as the human person, who is guided by a set of ethics and virtues, can direct the technology, then I think these are very helpful and hopeful things in terms of life extension and all of the rest. Where I draw the line is what they make a distinction between soft AI, soft artificial intelligence, and hard artificial intelligence. I don't believe that we are just spiritual machines. I don't think that it's just a matter of taking out the data of my DNA, of my brain, and encoding it in a computer, and then having that computer live my life. I don't think that is immortality. And I don't think it's going to be able to happen, because I think human beings, in their essence, are distinct from machines. Now, there are some technologists like Ray Kurzweiler, who has written the book on singularity. These are brilliant people, but I think are mistaken on the basis of rejecting the concept of metaphysics. Now, I don't want to go too heavily into philosophy, but metaphysics tell us something about our being, what we are as distinct from our physicality. And I don't think that the sum total of who human beings are can be summed up in our physicality. I think there's some transcendent quality to the human person that goes beyond the physical, so that while the technological can enhance, and it's the same thing as I said about entrepreneurs with profits and wealth, we must touch this lightly in the sense that we must never see the technology as the end toward which we are going. It's not a matter of the data, it's a matter of the meaning behind the data, and that's what gets us into the discussion of metaphysics and broadly understood transcendence and even theology.
The Templeton Foundation asked us this year to comprise a list of 20 questions. I don't know if you got the email and you sent it in. So one of the questions I asked, and they were supposed to be really big questions, just you could ask anything. I mean, it could have to do with baseball or something else, but I asked the question, will my great-grandchildren be able to just download information into their brain? And what are the implications there? So, I mean, you've touched on that a little bit, but I think that there are definitely some ethical issues coming down the pipeline in technology.
I think the ethical issues aren't just with the technology of these kind of computers, but more so with the volatile subject of the technology of biology and chemistry. The things that touch on the origin of life and cloning and hybrid human-animal entities. I think this is even more urgent to my way of thinking than the question of robots and the like.
I think we had a question from the audience. I saw a hand go up.
Father Sirico. I mean, I've known you and read your articles, but I never saw one of your talks. It's really impressive. I may even consider going back to church after that. I think it was Lord Acton who distinguished between the ethics of responsibility and the ethics of intention.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is, given the size of the organization, why the Catholic Church has not some kind of break so that when there is a pronunciation by its highest authority, the ethics of intention are checked by the ethics of responsibility?
Well, you ask a very good question. I'm writing a book now on the working title is The Economics of the Parables. So what I want to do is go through the parables and pull out some of the dimensions that are presupposed in the parables about profit and loss and investment and the like. And one of those parables touches on exactly what you're saying here, responsibility and intention. And it's the parable of the two sons. It's not one of the best known of the parables, but it's the parable where the father tells his two sons to go into the field and work. And the one son says, yes, I will, and doesn't. And the other son says, no, I won't, and does. And this is exactly the intention and the accomplishment. I think that what we have in society right now, including the church, because the church is part of society, is a seduction in the way socialism, and call it what you want, communism, collectivism, social market, all of those kind of ways of seeing the economy is primarily organized from a center of some sort and managed from the center, that socialism sounds more human and more fuzzy and more loving, because it speaks about the social dimension of society. And on the other hand, you have a capitalist, free market economy that emphasizes these virtues of initiative and individual action, and even in some cases speaking about the virtue of selfishness and various kinds of things like this. On the level of history, the social system, the economic system that has spoken about the society itself has not tended to the field. In fact, it's left many bodies on the field, if you get my meaning. Whereas the system that seemed to be all about me has really done more to lift up the most vulnerable in the world. I mean, here's a heretical statement for you that you can bring to Rome and see what happens. I do not believe for a moment that the rise out of poverty, which our world has seen in the last roughly 200 years, has been the result of charitable programs, governmental programs, all the kind of generosity or care packages or anything. That the rise out of poverty that we have seen in virtually every place on this planet, in terms of accessibility to portable water, to caloric intake, to housing, to shelter, to medical care, and all of the rest, has been the result of globalization. It's been the result of the expansion of markets and the increase in the division of labor. That's what the result of it. It wasn't intended, but that's what happened. I think we need to bring intention into the moral question. And I think that the practitioners, very often the practitioners of free enterprise, have been too preoccupied with practicing it and not preoccupied enough with articulating it from a moral dimension. We saw that, and others long before I came on the scene, have seen those important questions. But when Chris and I, Chris, by the way, who is the co-founder of the Institute, is in the back of the room as well, when we saw this divide and this increasing divide, we began the Acton Institute. It's not a Catholic institution, but it's to promote a dialogue on ethics and markets, And your question, the most provocative part of your question was having to do with the pronouncements, particularly under this pontificate. I think this Pope is probably, I mean, I'm not his confessor, so I'm in no position to say, but a very holy man, a very generous man, a very sincere man. But he is a man. And he grew up in the context of a society where profit was the result of a certain favoritism amongst a clique. When I look for this Pope's words on what he wants, what is it you want? Not how are you going to bring it about, but what is it you want? What he wants is people on the periphery of our societies to be brought in. That to me, Of course. Right. Where are you from, by the way? Uruguay, okay. Because you could have been from Argentina, you know? Or Venezuela, if you want to. Yeah, if you want to see it on stilts, look at Venezuela right now. And he's a Latin American. I mean, I think you know better than I do what the Pope's problem is.
My question was why the church doesn't put a break on that, because the church should know better, because you are an example of that.
I think the church knows better. You know, in the scholastic tradition, particularly in the encyclical Centesimus Annus, which brought so much of that together. But we go through various moments, various cycles, and this Pope, it's a draining time for me in one sense, in that I've been more busy this last month, both with conferences and the encyclical and what's going on in the United States now, than I've been in my whole life, and yet it's what I exist for. To be a man of mission. And I'm not, to go back to the question you mentioned, the gratification question, I'm not building something for tomorrow. What I want to put in place are enough seeds and build a network of people that they will be harvested long after I'm gone.
Father Sirico, I identify myself as a Christian. I'm a Methodist. My family, we attend Methodist Church. I was having lunch, this was just 2 weeks ago, with a female parishioner who received her PhD in divinity from Duke University. And she was telling me that she's a socialist because socialism, in her opinion, best fits the teachings of Jesus. And she was citing example after example. Jesus never had anything nice to say about money. Jesus' entire ministry was focused on giving. The whole concept of love is about sacrifice. And I've noticed being involved in the church, just in my own life, that I see, and this is anecdotal, but I see a lot of sort of far left teachings coming out of a religious background. I know in Latin America, in particular, you see it in Latin America. And I don't agree with any of it, but you see it. What do you, as a Christian, what are some responses that you would suggest to people who do say, if Jesus advocated an economic or political philosophy, it would mimic or would be socialistic because of the emphasis on charity and poor. Thank you.
Well, in point of fact, Jesus did not advocate a political philosophy. He didn't come to establish, a governmental system. If there's anything clear, you know who wanted to do that was Judas. He's the one who wanted that, and Jesus didn't want that. Jesus came to be the Savior of the world. That's what he came to do. And while there are all kinds of economic and social ramifications to the teachings of Jesus, one of those ramifications is not that we should be able to coerce other people into doing our bidding or what we think is best for them. Now, for all of the talk about sharing and for all of the talk about loving and giving and even having things in common, There is never anywhere in the New Testament a repudiation for the right to one's private property. That's clear from the Acts of the Apostles, where it talks about having all things in common. The people who did that did it because they were inspired to be generous, to do it. If you look in the parables that I was referring to, the importance of people being faithful in small things and being given more responsibilities precisely because they are faithful. The whole notion that people are created in the image and likeness of God, being creative in the way He was creative. I could go through any number of these things. The parable of the Good Samaritan is not a charter for the welfare state. It is precisely a charter for us to act on our neighbor's behalf because they are in need. The Good Samaritan did not give the responsibility over to anyone else. He took the man, put him on the beast, and tended his needs and his wounds. And when he finally did turn him over to somebody else, he in effect left his credit card and said, when I'm back through, I'll pay you for anything else you've done. This is the inspiration of Jesus, not the bureaucratic welfare state. And how people don't get that point. So a few years back when I think it was the tsunami that hit, somebody, could have been your theologian friend there, said to me, isn't it appalling? I just read the statistics that I forget whether it was Denmark or Sweden or maybe the Scandinavian countries, they have given more money to aid relief to the tsunami victims than the United States. I said, really? They said, yes, isn't that appalling? Doesn't that tell you how evil capitalism is? So I just did a little Google check. Thank God for technology. And I said, wait a minute. It is true that these nations, as governments, sent more aid over than the United States. But the American people, acting on their own moral sentiments, gave more than all of the rest of the world combined. Now, who is tending the field? Who is doing the Father's will?
Well, first, thank both of you for the questions and the answers, really refreshing and enlightening. I can't resist, but there was an Anglican bishop in the early 19th century, he was a precursor of Austrian economics, Robert Whately. He mentioned our Lord Jesus Christ only once gave food to the people, but he healed them many times. The only one miracle is about giving food, but
Actually, it was twice.
Twice, sorry. But we spoke a lot today about cronyism and corruption and bad examples. Now, through your life, I know you have met wonderful businessmen who try to live a principled life in business and sometimes might be frustrated, by what they see. But can you share a few examples of people who live the business vocation as you think should be lived, consistent with a free society?
Well, this is bringing coals to Newcastle, isn't it? But I mean, Sir John Templeton is a great example of a man who lived this humble life. We awarded him our Faith and Freedom Award many years ago and invited him to come to Grand Rapids to receive that award. And the person who went to the airport to pick him up met him in the airport, and Sir John got off the plane. He came from here to Michigan with a little bag. And as the guy was waiting for him, he figured, well, he'll be right off the plane. And the plane is emptying out and emptying out and emptying out. And finally, Sir John came in. The guy who picked him up said, did you have a problem on the plane? He said, no. He said, well, I expected that you would be among the first people out. He said, oh, I didn't travel first class. Now, this is a billionaire not traveling first class. Now, that's his decision. If he was as big as me, maybe he would have preferred to sit in a bigger seat. Or the recently departed François Michelin, who I got to know. This is the patriarch of the Michelin Tire Company. Chris and I were visiting him in France. Again, he showed up at the airport in his little simple gray suit, I thought there would have been a driver there to meet us and get our bags, and he gets the bags, and I said, no, Monsieur Michelin, we'll take care of this. And he walked through the airport, and you could see the people knew who he was, in Clermont-Ferrand, which is the headquarters of Michelin Tire Company. And we drove a little cart to a nondescript little car. And I couldn't tell what it was. We barely got all the bags in. And as I walked around the car, I just wanted to look at the tires. And so I got into the car, and Mr. Michelin was going to drive. And I said, Monsieur Michelin, I'm sorry to say I didn't see that these were Michelin tires on your car. He said, no, they are not yet Michelin tires. And then he had this little box with all these things you could push. He said, this is, and he began pushing this. These were test tires. And he could tell you the air pressure, the heat, all of the different things on each of the tires. I said, we're driving on test tires? And he said, Mon père, you would not expect me to sell these to other people if I was not prepared to drive them myself? You know, this is the kind of thing. I should tell you just apropos nothing, but just a little quip about Michelin. So we went to a restaurant. He took us to a restaurant, which was, you could tell it was a working class. I mean, it's a French restaurant. It was delicious. But it wasn't a Michelin star restaurant, right? You figured you're with Monsieur Michelin. He would look up in the Guide Rouge, just a nice restaurant. And when we were done eating, I said, Monsieur Michelin, this is a very nice restaurant. I really enjoyed the food and the wine and everything. He said, thank you. I said, why don't you give it a star? He said, oh, no, mon père. He said, I remember once I was out with the gentleman who really is the editor of the Red Book, the Michelin Guide. He said, and we were out that night, and we all had this beautiful fish dinner, and I said, we should give them some stars. And this gentleman, he said, no, we wait, we decide tomorrow. He said, that night we all got sick. He said, so Father, we will decide tomorrow if we give them a star.
Okay. About what we were talking about earlier, I guess a slightly vague question. I'm curious how it kind of relates to the Acton Institute. It seems like, part of what, Jesus talks about is certainly he's not trying to support Caesar, right? Quite the opposite. His kingdom is not of this world. And it seems like socialism, if anything, is implemented, always is about Caesar. And I'm curious sort of how, that should relate to, the actions of state officials or the actions which must be taken by ordinary people to sort of implement these, ideas which people think are going to be somehow more fair, and sort of how would that sort of, the morality of, I guess, operationalizing these ideas, how would that kind of relate to the Acton Institute or other areas of ethics?
When our Lord, they were trying to trap him, and they give him the coin, no, he asks for the coin. And he says, whose image is on this coin? They say, Caesar's. And he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. One of the great lines in all of literature, right? What Christ does there is set a whole new way of thinking about the social order. That there must, again, to go back to the authority and power distinction that I made, that what Christ is saying is that government has its place, but it cannot demand from you the allegiance that you owe to God, who is the origin of our lives. In an institutional way, in a procedural way, how do you go about balancing? Is that really the question? How do you go about balancing the role of the state versus the
Is there a mission to, or a way in which leaders maybe should talk more about the details of what ordinary people, or what state officials or people tasked with carrying these things out, what the crimes they must commit, as it were, or against common decency if nothing else, not justice itself?
Yeah, I think de Tocqueville said something very interesting. He said, "How is it possible that society should escape destruction if the moral tie is not strengthened in proportion as the political tie is relaxed?" So the way I would look at it is society is formed by the traditions, the mores, the etiquette of people who have this consensual and reciprocal relationship with one another. The state is there to guarantee certain fundamental rights, the right to life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness, those kinds of things. And the politicians and bureaucrats simply need to understand that role of modesty, that their intervention should take place only temporarily and when all of the other aspects, social aspects of society have failed. There are instances where things fail, and you need some kind of someone to come from the outside to help an individual or to help a family or to help a whole community. But those need to be really, they should just proceed very modestly and cautiously and humbly so that they pull out when society begins to function again. But, you know, Acton also said power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So what ends up happening is good people go into government and they just get caught up with the idea of how much good they can do without seeing the other part of the modesty part that's necessary. That's why I think, you know, when people say, well, we want to get good people into government, I think the more key question is to limit the government and just to have that in our ethic, in our ethos, how we approach things, to limit even the people going in should have that. How much can I not do today in order to create a vacuum for society to really do it?
I have a comment and a question. Given the scandals on Wall Street, the LIBOR scandal, the interest rate scandal, and all the other issues pertaining to the financial crisis, clearly there's a need for more ethics in the financial system. And I think it should start probably in the schools of business in the United States. And since the financial crisis started in 2007, I don't think that there's been any change in the teachings in most of the universities in the schools of business. And my question is, do you think that the Templeton Foundation could perhaps influence a higher level of ethical teaching of ethics in finance in the universities of the United States? The second comment I want to make is that I had the opportunity to see Sir John in my office on several occasions, and we divide the sessions into talks about his eyes and talks about finance, because I always tried to learn from him as much as I could. But he was always intrigued with the relationship between medicine and religion. And I know, I can tell you from my own experience in dealing with patients, especially with surgery, those patients who have a deep belief or strong belief always do far better in their surgical outcomes than non-believers. And I believe the linkage is due to the fact that those who are strong believers have much less stress associated in their lives. And we all know that the more stress you have, the less well your immune system works, and therefore the less well you recover from surgery. So that's just a comment, but I'd like you to answer the first question, please.
I'm sure you can add a lot to this too, because she practices what I preach. So let's do that together. On the question of business ethics and the schools. I think for the most part, at least in the American Academy, that what they are teaching under the rubric of business ethics is how to just abide by the law. And I think business ethics, if you're going to really understand it, has to exceed that. It has to be something that is interior and three-dimensional in a person. So it's not ethics in the sense that you're just abiding by the contracts or what the law says, but that you're doing good. You're actually doing good as well as doing well. And the great tragedy and the great crisis of the American Academy at this point is its secularization and the political correctness that reigns over this this whole system, because to speak of virtue, to speak of moral obligation, to speak of God, even if you want to speak of these things broadly, is to be excised from academia. And I think this is largely the problem of, now the failing in 2007, 2008 with the housing market that kind of precipitated really was a problem of removing culpability and responsibility from people so that they could just transfer the stuff down the line. So everybody just saw themselves as making money on things and they had no responsibility for the people who were coming to them to take these loans out. And part of what happens in Wall Street, as I've already alluded, the kind of crony capitalism, is also the massive amount of regulations that come down on businesses. So when they're so complex, you can hide a lot of dirt in between the cracks. And so this is why, by the way, I think a real radical transparency is required, so that if I'm putting an investment in, or selling my goods to the market, I have to be able to disclose these things. But there are regulations that give businesses certain favors over other businesses. As to the role of the Templeton Foundation, I'd really like Lauren to address that more fully. But if you just read her bibliography, you'll see the kind of very practical things along the lines you're saying.
I mean, I would say, I suppose the Templeton Foundation could fund, more classes in ethics in a business school or something like that. If you want my personal opinion, I believe that ethics can never be taught in a business school. You cannot go there to get your MBA and take a class in ethics and then behave better as a financial professional. I don't think that would ever work. I think ethics and character development are very much taught in the church, in your community, in your home. I think you learn it from your parents. I don't think you read it in a book. I don't think a finance professor is going to ever be able to teach you that. The Templeton Foundation does fund a great deal of work in character development programs. My mom actually started one of the first ones for Sir John in his hometown of Winchester, Tennessee, called the Laws of Life Essay Contest. And just having children at a young age write about what they feel is important and the laws that govern their life, I think would make a larger impact than teaching another ethics course in business. But then also a lot of the calamity that occurred in financial markets was the result of government interference. You had, low interest rates, trying to stimulate activity post the internet bubble. Governments incentivized home ownership, and people were allowed to buy homes without really putting anything down. Government incentivized all that activity. So I think Wall Street is often villainized for no good reason. I really do think it was government. I don't think you can teach ethics in a college course. I don't know if that answered your question, but I think the Templeton Foundation tries to address that more at a younger age. But again, my personal opinion, I've got a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old, and I'm trying to teach them those lessons at home or hoping that they'll pick that up in church. I think the church question we've debated today is really fascinating. Just a little bit, we debate religion a lot in my family. So Sir John was a Presbyterian. His brother, my grandfather, was an atheist. My aunt is Jewish. My mother-in-law is an Episcopalian priest. I mean, we have just everybody in our family, all sorts of different traditions and faiths, and we're always talking about religion. It is fascinating that two brothers, Sir John and my grandfather, could come from the same family, the exact same environment, and one be atheist and one be Presbyterian. It's just interesting. But my mother-in-law is always complaining. My husband and I think a lot about free markets and write about free markets, and what we notice is that there is a lot of leftist sort of leaning in the church, especially in the Episcopalian church. And my mother-in-law is always complaining about she doesn't have enough members in her church, membership is dying down, what is she going to do about it? But she votes for politicians that are promoting these social programs, and we try to explain to her, well, you're really, voting your competition. I mean, that's competition for you. So the people who attend your church, people look for a safety net in society. And one is the church, the other is government. And so we try to kind of talk about that with her, but I do think that is a fascinating dialogue. And just, I think I know what your answer is, but is organized religion compatible with freedom and individual rights and free enterprise, the spirit of entrepreneurship and creativity at an individual level? Are those two at odds, or do they exist together? And
not only do they exist together, we invented it. The anthropology of the Judeo-Christian religion, which places the emphasis on the dignity of the human person, created in the image and likeness of God, who is called to have a responsibility in nature, to tend the garden, if you will, the institutions of private property and contract, judiciary. The university was invented by the church. The hospital was invented by the church. Forms of international charity, institutionalized and international charity were invented by the church. I mean, prior to that, there was almsgiving, but it took the church's organizational sensibility to build international institutions and organized charity. So yes, I think not only do I think that it is compatible, I think that it came first. The whole understanding of free markets as a social discipline, an economic discipline, comes out of the scholastic meditation on theology, on morality. And by the way, the other part of the Tocqueville quote that I didn't quote, it's the first part of the quote, says, "Despotism may govern without faith, but liberty cannot. Religion is much more necessary in democratic republics than it is in others." So that's my answer, and I'm sticking with it.
there you have it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. I know that many of us will be asking the Nassau Institute for a copy of this tape. It was magnificent. I again want to remember some of the people who made the Nassau Institute possible. John Thompson, who is not in very good shape, and then Rick Lowe is in better shape, but he was not here with us. A tireless worker for the Free Society.
Alex, may I just mention,
Yes.
I should have said this right at the beginning, that the first time I came to the Bahamas, it was at the invitation of the Nassau Institute. So I'm honored to be back.
Well, and thank you so much, and I think you're going to get more invitations. So thank you, Lawrence, thank you, Bob, and thank you to the Civil Society of Bahamas. Hope you keep improving your rule of law, because you have a competitive advantage over your neighbors on that one, and good luck. And thank you for everything.
This is beautiful. Thank you.